Ah, Paris, the city of lights, the heart of liberté, equalité, and fraternité. As soon as I bring up the name, a plethora of man-made wonders probably flood your mind. The soaring Eiffel Tower, the imposing Arc de Triomphe, and the beautiful Art of the Louvre. But first among them, of course, is the Cathedral Notre Dame de Paris. This 12th century Gothic cathedral sits at the very heart of the city in the Ile de la Cite in the middle of the Seine, and has seen the entire history of the city unfold. It watched France emerge from the Hundred Years' War and turns itself into one of the great powers of Europe under Louis XIV. It survived the Jacobin mobs of the Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, and the destructive sieges that marked the end of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. Even Hitler and the Nazi war machine could barely leave a scratch on its limestone facade. It was said that as long as the cathedral stood, Paris would never fall, and God willing, it would stand until the end of time. Say, does anybody else smell smoke? As you might have guessed, we're taking the time machine back to April 15th, 2019, at approximately 6:51 p.m. local time in Paris. That was when the first dispatch calls went out to the Paris Fire Brigade for the report of a structure fire in the attic of the cathedral. Now, cathedral fires, for those of you fortunate enough not to work in a district or municipality where those are a concern, are a special kind of hell. Here in the US, the structures tend to be Type 4 heavy timber construction, sometimes Type 3 brick and mortar or Type 1 stone/concrete in the older cities like Boston and New York. In Europe, however, there's stadium-sized monstrosities that take up entire city blocks, most of which were already centuries old by the time the first colonists set foot in Virginia. They all share the same general design issues, though. Those 12 by 12 or greater frame joists that are the signature of heavy timber construction, they might take forever to burn through, but they act as an all-you-can-eat buffet once the fire reaches them. The roof pitches on these structures, usually 12 by 12 or 1 foot up for every foot over, are so steep that it's impossible to work on without a roof ladder. And the area between those roof pitches and the vaulted ceiling below, that's just one giant void space running the entire area of the building that the fire can spread through unseen. And then we have the steeples. Those towers are often built into the structure of the church roof themselves to give them extra support. So not only does this add a couple 100+ foot cylinder on top of that void space I just mentioned in the attic, but it also ensures that if either the roof goes or the steeple goes, the other is usually right behind it. And remember, these structures are often historic buildings, which come with a whole extra set of designations and rules regarding them. Putting in things like firewalls and sprinkler systems often ends up being as painful as asking your city council for a raise. Add it all together, and you have a recipe for disaster before the tones even drop. Now, let's do a quick size up of Notre Dame. This textbook example of Gothic architecture is 420 feet long, 157 feet wide, and 115 feet tall, not counting the spire or the bell towers. It's also hiding some serious structural demons in the walls, mainly the walls themselves. See, there's a reason when you look at earlier Romanesque churches, they're always a lot shorter and have walls thick enough they could stop an artillery shell. That's because architects back then couldn't make tall, thin walls that could support their own weight without falling over. They still hadn't really figured out this problem when Notre Dame was being built. They just added a lot of bracing around them. Those flying buttresses, the beautiful exterior arches that ring the cathedral's exterior, those keep the walls from crashing into the streets of Paris. The vaulted ceiling inside, that keeps them from falling on churchgoers in the middle of Mass. Then we get to the attic and bell towers. The attic, better known as the forest due to the maze of centuries-old oak timbers that it was made of, stretched across the roof of the cathedral like a giant cross, with the church's 315-foot spire right in the center of it. At the time of the fire, a massive restoration project was in the process of fixing the roof and spire, surrounding it with thousands of pounds of metal scaffolding that did nothing but impede fire operations. The two 285-foot bell towers connected to the attic via a joint atrium at the west end of the church, something that nearly brought down the church during the fire. The northern tower contained 8 bells, while the south tower contained 2 far larger ones. The cathedral was an imposing structure, and the idea of a fire inside haunted the nightmares of many a firefighter. If anyone was up to the task of fighting a fire in Notre Dame, though, it was the Paris Fire Brigade. See, this wasn't your average fire department. Most municipal fire departments fall under the term of paramilitary organizations, meaning they have a military-like command structure. The Brigade des Sapeurs-Pompiers de Paris, though, is an actual military unit, one of 2 in France along with the city of Marseille. It's an engineering unit in the French Army, hence the Sappers designation, and it's also the 3rd largest metropolitan fire service in the world, after the Tokyo Fire Department and FDNY at 8,550 members. The brigade was founded in 1793, when the chaos of the Revolution was providing no shortage of fires to deal with. That chaos led to a poorly equipped, undermanned, and ill-disciplined fire service, though, something Napoleon sought to fix after the disaster of a fire at the Austrian embassy in 1810 that nearly saw the emperor flambéed at his own wedding. The resulting militarization of the fire service under him was one of the few things to survive the chaos that defined 19th and to a lesser extent 20th century politics in France. The men and women of the brigade were a group that took their responsibilities seriously. Like all monuments in Paris, Notre Dame had its own incident action plan for a scenario just like April 15th, and the units closest to it had all trained on the site until they knew it like the back of their own hands. This wouldn't matter, though, as one design miscalculation in the cathedral had undone all their work before they had ever arrived. See, remember when I said we were starting at 6:51 p.m.? That was a bit of a lie. To get to the start of this incident, we actually have to go back to 6:18 p.m. when they assume the fire started. We're still not sure if it was a careless cigarette discarded by one of the workers restoring the roof spire, or a short circuit in the electrical system that could generously be described as haphazard. But regardless of the ignition source, the fire quickly spread amongst the roof joists that made up the fabled forest. The cathedral's fire detection system actually did its job and sounded the alarm at 6:20 p.m., but, well, remember what I said about historic building rules? Listen, I'm a history nerd myself. I get that nobody likes seeing wires and piping snaking their way through their 12th century French Gothic architecture. That doesn't mean you get to ignore the litany of issues that comes with compromising these systems for the sake of aesthetics. A combination of sprinkler systems and firewalls could have curbed, if not fully extinguished, this fire in the early stages had they been installed back in the last renovation in the 90s, but the sound the wind made whistling through the roof joist was just too iconic to be interrupted by those silly things. Frankly, I get the feeling the only reason Notre Dame had a standpipe system was because those could actually be hidden in the stairwells, out of sight and out of mind. Even the alarm system was compromised. Most buildings like Notre Dame have an automated alarm system that automatically contacts either an outside alarm company or even the emergency services directly themselves. This is to get a response rolling as soon as the detector is activated in case there's an actual emergency. Notre Dame, well, that one just went to the security office. The SOP at that point was for the guard on duty to climb the 300 steps up to the attic, a 6-minute climb, assuming the guard was in peak physical condition. And let's be honest, we all know better than to pretend that's the norm when it comes to private security, guys. At which point, he would confirm that yes, there was in fact a fire, and then he would have to climb all the way back down those 300 steps, run to the office, and call the fire department. Even in a best case scenario, There was a 20-minute delay built into the system from when the detector went off to when firefighters would have arrived on scene. The last time I saw a French response to a situation this slow and flat-footed, panzers were rolling through the Sudan. Even in legacy construction like this, a fire will have already grown to an uncontrollable size in a space this large, provided you have enough oxygen, well before the firefighters could have gone up there and put water on the fire. And once again, this is assuming everything went right. Not having something like, say, a brand new security guard going to the wrong part of the building because he couldn't read the confusing alarm system prompt. Because that's what happened. And when he predictably found nothing, he just assumed this was a false alarm and went right back to the security room. It wasn't until several more detectors started going off at approximately 6:43 p.m. that anybody realizes the mistake that had been made a good 15 minutes later. And by the time they got up to the main attic, the fire was already past the point of no return. All across the city, firefighters pulling out of their stations would have been able to see the clouds of smoke rolling off the cathedral roof at this point. As they approached, they would have noticed the smoke growing darker and more brownish in color as the fire engulfed the wood supports and began burning through the shingles. The firefighters from the barracks at 11 Quai de Conti would have had near front row seats to the spectacle happening across the river from them. By the time they and other units arrived on scene, the fire was already beginning to consume the central spire and push across the roof towards the iconic bell towers. Now, when I first saw the camera footage from CNN that day, I thought for sure this was an exterior fire operation only. So imagine my surprise when I found first-hand accounts from the firefighters inside the cathedral during the entire 12-hour fight to save it. Master Corporal Miriam Chudzinski would command the first unit to arrive on scene. The 27-year-old corporal and her team were highly skilled, highly trained, and had run through the pre-plan for the cathedral enough times they could do it in their sleep and knew the building layout like their own houses. They quickly got a water supply established, connected to the cathedral standpipe system, and began the 300-step climb up to the cathedral's attic. Miriam and her team didn't even make a dent in the fire up there, and they were never going to with just their handlines alone. See, there's a formula in the fire service known as the fire flow formula. It's designed to tell us roughly how much water we'd need for a fire, and it's pretty simple. You take the square footage for the burning area and divide by 3. If we plug in those numbers from our pre-plan earlier, that number comes out to a little under 22,000 gallons per minute for that fully involved attic. For comparison, a 2.5-inch handline, that only moves about 250 gallons per minute. And the Renault pumpers the brigade was using max out at roughly 750 gallons per minute. Notre Dame's pre-plan, much like the 20-minute delay in the alarm system, was built around outdated common knowledge, if you will, regarding Type 4 construction and those heavy wood joists. For the longest time, these structures were considered slow burning, and it was assumed that even with the delay, the fire would still be small enough to be easily extinguished. The fact is that while heavy wood timbers will take longer to burn to the point that they fail compared to lightweight residential wood construction, the fire will spread just as fast, if not faster, along the larger surface area these members have. Miriam and her team quickly ran into a wall of flames that refused to give them even an inch, and quickly began pushing past them towards the bell towers as they were forced to pull back to the stairway. The temperature inside the attic quickly began approaching 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit and threatened to flash over the entire structure. Many wouldn't blame Miriam and her fellow firefighters for pulling back at this point, but this wasn't just some empty 2-story residential. This was Notre Dame, and there wasn't a firefighter in Paris who was going to sit on their hands and watch it burn to the ground, if for no other reason than pride and the fact that their brothers and sisters were still inside. See, while Miriam and 49 other firefighters were doing St. Francis's work up in the attic, Chaplain Jean-Marc Fournier was doing the Lord's work down in the chapel. where he was directing an army of firefighters, police officers, and cathedral workers in removing every relic, statue, and painting inside the cathedral that wasn't cemented in place. When the keys to the cabinet containing the crown of thorns that supposedly sat atop Jesus' head during his crucifixion and the pieces of the one true cross couldn't be located, firefighters short on time and at risk of the stone ceiling falling on their heads did what firefighters do, smashed in the lock, and raised the holy relics outside wrapped up in their own turnout coats. Outside, General Jean-Marie Gontier had taken command and set up a command post in the square in front of the cathedral. Knowing the area hydrants wouldn't be able to supply enough water for what they needed, he ordered fireboats deployed to the Ile-de-Site to supply engines with water directly from the Seine as more and more apparatus arrived and began setting up for defensive operations. The fire was burning through most of the roof now as it marched towards the bell towers, the cathedral now shining from the air like a burning cross when viewed from drones flying above. The central spire stood in the center of the inferno like a burning spear. It had been burning since the fire had started at 6:18 p.m., and at 7:50 p.m., it finally gave up the ghost. Jasinski described the results inside as a giant bulldozer dropping dozens of boulders in a dumpster. The 750-ton structure collapsed towards the bell towers, smashing not only through what was left of the attic trusses, but the vaulted ceiling below that and into the cathedral itself. A massive fireball rolled through the attic, sending the crew scrambling for the protected stairwells as it threatened to engulf them. Merriman and her crew only managed to survive because they happened to be behind a stone knee wall at the time of the collapse. Down below them, crews poured out of the cathedral doors in panic as thousands of tons of stone, wood, and lead smashed into the marble floor at the center of the chapel. Chaos reigned as Gontier tried to figure out if any units had been killed, wounded, or trapped in the collapsing spire, and Fournier quickly rallied a small group of firefighters and led them back inside to make one last sweep of the cathedral for any relics they had missed. The collapse proved to be the final straw for interior operations in the attic, as the order was soon given at 8:20 p.m. to pull out and commence exterior operations while a new action plan was devised. 7 aerial apparatus were positioned around the cathedral, and additional hose lines were dragged through the buildings across the street from the cathedral's north and south walls, aimed at third story and attic windows supporting them as they began to pour water over the burning roof. Yes, I said over, not on. The thing about medieval vaulted ceilings cathedrals like Notre Dame have is that they are fragile eggshells when it comes to forces and loads applied directly downwards on them. The spire had already smashed a 100-square-foot hole in the cathedral ceiling, and nobody was eager to find out if what was left would withstand multiple hose streams, capable of knocking over brick walls being directed right at it. So firefighters were forced to arc their hose streams over Notre Dame and let the water gently fall onto the burning roof like a curtain. The same ceiling issues prevented firefighters from advancing hose lines into the chapel, where burning debris from the spire and stuff still raining down from the attic were beginning to set fires in the pews and threaten the altar. The Colossus firefighting robot, basically a bomb squad robot fitted with a ground monitor and connected to a hose line, was sent in to deal with these spot fires. A lot's been made of robots in the firefighting service, both for and against. In my mind, though, this is an example of how they should be used. Rather than replacing firefighters, they're just another tool for us. You have to remember, even with almost 500 firefighters on scene, there still wasn't enough manpower to be risking a dozen men under that crumbling ceiling, especially with everything else they had going on at the moment. So, while the fire brigade fell back to come up with a plan to save the cathedral, the Colossus trundled along on its remote-controlled task, oblivious to the danger above it. Outside on the street, the commanding officer of the fire brigade, Jean-Claude Galette, was meeting with President Macron and other officials to discuss what to do next. The situation he described was grim. The attic of the cathedral couldn't be saved, and the resulting fireball from the spire's collapse had been the final push needed for the fire to spread into the northern bell tower. The logic was simple. If the fire spread to the bracing around the 8 bells inside, they'd eventually fall and bring the north tower down with it. The resulting domino effect would probably take the south tower as well, and at that point, Notre Dame would be little more than a pile of rubble. As if things weren't going to hell already, there was another problem. The standpipe system in the North Tower was leaking and couldn't keep the pressure needed for firefighting operations. Gillette proposed a Hail Mary. The crew would scale the South Tower carrying as much hoseline as they could with them. Once on the platform between the two towers, they'd unroll and lower the hoses over the exterior facade to waiting crews on the ground to be hooked up to engines, and use those to bypass the standpipe to fight the fire. It was a risky, nearly suicidal plan, as any crew sent up into that tower would be exposed to the roaring flames of the attic and would be unable to evacuate in time if the tower collapsed, even assuming their escape route hadn't been cut off by the flames. Gillette and his command staff knew that any firefighter that went up there did so with the knowledge that there's no guarantee they'd be coming down alive. It was the only chance they had, though, so the decision was made to find a crew. As he left the command brief, Gillette gave Macron the only thing he could promise. In 20 minutes, we'll know if we lost it. Gillette gave the go-ahead to Master Sergeant Remy Lemaire to put together a crew for his operation. More than a few firefighters refused the assignment, and frankly, I don't really blame them. It's easy to say you jump at the task if you're behind a computer screen, thousands of miles away, 6 years after the fact. It's a lot harder when that suicide mission is staring you dead in the face. Enough firefighters, roughly 24 in number though, were found, and at 9:30 p.m. the Hail Mary play began. Once on the platform, Lemaire split his crew into two groups. One, led by him, would attack the fire in the bow tower. The second, made up of about a dozen other firefighters, would hold a line against the fire raging in the attic and protect the causeway that was Lemaire's only line of escape. For a tense 15 minutes, it was touch and go. Lemaire worked his way up floor by floor in the bow tower, embers raining down in his head and one eye always on the bells above him, looking for any hints of an impending collapse. Down below him, the other crew alternated setting up a wall of water to keep the flames at bay in the attic and spraying down the bracing that Lemaire was standing on to extinguish fires from embers that had dropped on his head. Finally, though, at 9:45 p.m., Lemaire radioed that the fire in the bell tower was under control. At 11 p.m., a sopping wet Gillette, grinning ear to ear, descended the bell tower stairs and told Macron and the other officials the danger had finally passed. The Hail Mary had worked, and while there was still another 7 hours before the last embers in the roof had been put out, Notre Dame had been saved. By sunrise the next day, the fire in Notre Dame would be declared out. Though the roof had been almost completely burned away and millions of dollars of damage had occurred, the stone walls of the cathedral would still be standing tall. Thanks to the heroics of the Paris's firefighters, most of the cathedral's artifacts, including the organ, all three stained glass windows, and countless works of art, would survive with only minor smoke and water damage. Almost 500 firefighters would respond to Notre Dame, and despite the perilous work they had performed during the first few hours, only one firefighter and 2 police officers would be injured during the blaze. Given the history these structures have of being man-eaters even to this day, I'd call that a true miracle of the night. There's a lot that can be learned from the fire that tore through Notre Dame. The reports that came out caused a wave of reassessments and renovations across Europe and America regarding fire safety in cathedrals and firefighter pre-plans regarding the structures, something you should consider if you have any in your first due. During my research on Notre Dame, I started asking the older members of my department about the churches in our area and looking inside to see what they had from my own eyes. And I was surprised at the stuff I found. Go to these churches, figure out their construction, and take a look inside. Learn the interior layouts, especially where the stairs are to the steeple in the attic. This knowledge is going to save lives. Yours first and foremost when one of these places goes up in flames. And remember, these videos aren't a Monday morning quarterback. They're to make sure that when disaster happens, we perform to the best of our ability so others may live.